The elderly man remained motionless, suspended in a quietude that only those at the threshold of the end truly understand, waiting with a patient, practiced discipline until the morphine had fully permeated his system and dulled the sharpest edges of his physical distress. Only when the medicine had done its silent chemical work did he finally prepare himself to speak. His daughter, Margaret, sat in a vigil of somber grace beside the narrow bed, positioned within a house that had long ago surrendered its scent to the pervasive aromas of camphor, dried cedar, and the peculiar sweet dust smell of aging paper. She held his hand with a firm, grounding pressure, a silent acknowledgement of the reality the doctors had articulated with clinical brevity, that the time remaining was no longer measured in months or weeks, but in the fleeting intervals of a single night. For 41 years, this man had functioned as a ghost within the machine of the state. He had spent 4 decades navigating the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of government buildings, his identity subsumed by the vast administrative apparatus he served. He was a man of the record, a custodian of the written word who had affixed his signature to thousands of documents that no living person outside a hermetically sealed, high-security archive had ever laid eyes upon. On this final night, with the window of the bedroom cracked just enough to allow the muted, rhythmic sounds of the city street below to drift inside like a ghost of the living world, he began to recount what he had discovered during his tenure. He spoke of the pre-1913 books, volumes that existed in the shadows of the official record. Margaret wrote. She did not question, she did not interrupt, she simply transcribed his words with the urgency of a witness, capturing every syllable, every pause, and every heavy breath. If this narrative is unfamiliar to you, if you are encountering these concepts for the first time, I urge you to listen with an open but critical mind. What is presented here does not exist within the boundaries of any approved academic curriculum. It was not taught in the prestigious universities your parents attended, nor was it whispered in the lecture halls where their parents were educated. The history of the global financial architecture, as it stood prior to the pivotal year of 1913, has been managed, manicured, and curated with extraordinary precision for over a century. What Edmund Callaway saw, and what he carried in the silent vaults of his memory for 40 years, is an account that fundamentally reframes the standard understanding of modern civilization. It challenges the conventional wisdom regarding money, the nature of national sovereignty, and the identity of those who have been making existential decisions on behalf of global populations that were never consulted and never gave their informed consent to the systems that now govern their lives. Edmund Callaway was a child of the 19th century, born in 1881 in the industrial heartland of Pennsylvania. His lineage was one of hard work and sudden misfortune. His grandfather had been a prosperous mill owner who saw his entire life's work evaporated in the searing heat of a financial panic. The family had recovered, but the recovery was a slow, agonizing process that left an indelible mark on Edmund's psyche. From a very young age, he displayed a preternatural affinity for mathematics. He possessed a cognitive architecture that allowed him to hold complex columns of figures and intricate financial ratios in his mind with the same ease that other children held the lyrics to popular songs. By the age of 19, his reputation for accuracy and discretion had secured him a position as a records assistant in a regional federal office. He was so proficient, so unnervingly precise in his duties, that he was quickly identified as a candidate for advancement. He was transferred, promoted, and eventually relocated to a specialized position in Washington, D.C., a role that required a level of security clearance so obscure that most of the senior staff in his own department were unaware of its existence. The vast majority of Edmund's professional life was spent within the bowels of buildings that appeared on no public floor plans. He worked in rooms that lacked windows and were shielded against electronic interference, handling documents that arrived in heavy, lead-lined cases secured with wax seals and dual-key locks. His primary task was the cross-referencing of ledgers that predated the very institutions he worked for. These were records that had been transferred into federal custody from older, defunct offices and sovereign systems that had been absorbed or superseded during the expansion of the American state. Calloway was not a man of curiosity in the traditional sense. He did not ask questions out loud. He was a creature of duty. He read what was placed before him, he recorded the data he was instructed to capture, and he returned every evening to a modest, quiet house in a neighborhood populated by people who, like him, never discussed the specifics of their labor over the dinner table. He eventually married and fathered a daughter, but his domestic happiness was cut short when his wife passed away while Margaret was still a young girl. He raised her alone in that atmosphere of disciplined silence, never revealing the true nature of his work beyond the vague, bureaucratic descriptions he provided on his annual tax filings. Margaret grew up in the shadow of a father who was a pillar of the administrative state, a man who was trusted with the deepest secrets of the ledger, yet who remained a mystery even to his own kin. It was not until she was 43 years old, sitting by his deathbed, that the silence was finally broken. The conversation she had anticipated was one of personal reconciliation, perhaps a confession of a hidden regret, or the reopening of an old family wound. Instead, what Calloway gave her was a technical description of a financial architecture so vast, so ancient, and so systematically obscured that she sat in a state of paralyzed silence for nearly an hour after he finished his initial summary. Only then did she pick up her pen and begin to write the first line of what would become an 11-year obsession. Margaret Calloway dedicated the next decade of her life to the impossible task of verifying her father's claims. Operating without the benefit of institutional backing or a background in investigative journalism, she became a ghost in the archives herself. She traveled to remote university libraries, tracked down retired clerks who refused to speak on the record, and navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the National Archives. Against all odds, she managed to locate 3 of the specific documents her father had referenced by their serial numbers. She confirmed the existence of 2 highly specialized offices he had named, entities that had been quietly folded into larger departments without any public announcement or legislative record. Most significantly, she discovered a partial ledger in a Midwest University special collections that matched her father's description of the pre-1913 formatting. Her work was not a formal report. It was a sprawling, meticulously organized collection of notes, receipts, and handwritten summaries that she kept in a fireproof box beneath her bed, a secret legacy that remained hidden until the day she died. It was her son who eventually found the box and began the process of synthesizing the information. To truly grasp the magnitude of what Edmund Calloway witnessed, one must first understand what the pre-1913 books represented as a functional category of documentation. Prior to the signing of the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913, the United States, and indeed much of the Western world, operated its monetary and fiscal affairs under a paradigm that is almost unrecognizable to the modern observer. The public history of this era focuses on the surface-level debates, the tension between gold and silver, the rivalry between private banking interests and public sovereignty, and the recurring panics that supposedly necessitated the creation of a central bank. However, what is omitted from the history books is the fact that the transition from the old system to the new one involved a transfer of records so massive and so deliberately mismanaged that it created a permanent structural gap in the federal archive. This archival gap was not the result of bureaucratic incompetence or the chaos of transition. In the world of high-level administration, gaps of this magnitude are never accidental. They are a matter of intentional design. The architects of the post-1913 financial order were not careless individuals. They were men of extreme precision, who understood a fundamental truth about the control of information. The most effective way to suppress a record is not to burn it, which leaves a conspicuous trail of destruction, but to bury it under a mountain of irrelevant data. They surrounded the core truths with layers of competing material, complex cross-references, and shifting administrative labels,
ensuring that any researcher who stumbled upon the trail would exhaust their resources and their sanity long before they reached the center of the labyrinth.
Calloway's description of his first encounter with these books was visceral, almost physical in its intensity. He remarked that the volumes were significantly larger than any modern ledger he had ever seen. The paper was of a different grade entirely, heavier, with a unique texture and a durability that suggested it was manufactured from a material other than standard wood pulp or cotton. The bindings were not the standard issue leather or buckram used by the government printing office. They were reinforced with engraved metal clasps in a style that Calloway had seen on the facades of grand neoclassical buildings, but never on the spine of a book. When he opened the first volume, he realized immediately that he was looking at a system of notation that predated the 20th century by a considerable margin. It wasn't just the age of the ink, it was the underlying logic of the entries. He said he knew this with the same intuitive certainty that a linguist knows a text is ancient before they even translate the first word, simply because the assumptions embedded in the structure of the language belong to a different world. These ancient ledgers operated on a set of premises that have been entirely purged from modern economic thought. For instance, the books assumed that land was not a commodity to be bought and sold on a speculative market, but a foundational asset that remained outside the reach of private ownership. They operated on the principle of stewardship, the idea that authority over a territory was granted based on demonstrated competence and the preservation of continuity, rather than through the mechanics of conquest or the accumulation of debt-based capital. This is where the account enters territory that many find difficult to reconcile with their existing worldview. What Calloway was describing, though he lacked the specific terminology used by contemporary independent researchers, was the administrative remains of a global civilization that is increasingly being identified by the name Tartaria. The use of the word Tartaria is not a flight of fancy or a digital conspiracy theory. It is a pointer toward a massive body of suppressed evidence that spans the fields of cartography, architecture, and demographics. For centuries, the name Tartaria appeared on the maps produced by the most prestigious and technically proficient cartographic houses in Europe. It was documented by Ortelius, by Blau, and by Mercator. These maps did not depict a vague, lawless wilderness, but a structured administrative reality, a vast territory stretching from the borders of Eastern Europe across the plains of Central Asia to the shores of the Pacific. It was marked with the names of great cities, complex trade routes, and regional divisions that correspond to no political entity recognized in the history books written after the mid-19th century. The standard academic dismissal suggests that these maps were merely imprecise, and that Tartaria was a catch-all term used by ignorant Europeans to describe a region they did not understand. This explanation, however, collapses under the weight of the map's own technical sophistication. The coastlines are rendered with a precision that should have been impossible according to the official timeline of maritime technology. The river systems are mapped with an accuracy that reflects deep, localized knowledge. The place names are not the inventions of a distant cartographer. They are the phonetic transcriptions of a functioning administrative language. When researchers began to compare the terminology found in the pre-1913 books with the labels on these Tartarian maps, the correlation was found to be structural, not coincidental. Edmund Calloway, working in isolation in his windowless room, did not know he was looking at the debris of a lost empire. He only knew that the formatting of the ledgers was alien, that the units of account were based on a logic he couldn't fully grasp, and that the originating authorities for the entries were names that did not exist on any map of the United States he had ever seen. One specific entry haunted Calloway for the rest of his life. It was a record of a massive transfer of assets, where the originating authority was written in a script that defied his attempts at identification. However, a later hand had added a translation in the margin, identifying the entity as the Office of Continental Settlement. The recipient of this transfer was a predecessor to the very department where Calloway was employed. The date of the entry was precise, and he made sure Margaret wrote it down with absolute accuracy. When she later attempted to find any mention of this Office of Continental Settlement or the specific transfer in the public record,
she found nothing but a void. That particular year is described by historians as a period of administrative sparse data, a convenient euphemism used to explain away the lack of documentation during the era of westward expansion and industrial consolidation.
Calloway had a far more sobering explanation for this absence. He believed it was a professional redaction, a scrubbing of the record so thorough that it removed the very memory of the event. He noted that whoever performed the redaction possessed a level of skill that was almost terrifying. They didn't just remove pages, they adjusted the surrounding entries to create the illusion of a seamless, uninterrupted flow of data. This is the art of making a gap look like a lack of activity rather than a removal of evidence. It is a technique that requires an institutional memory that spans generations. Calloway suspected that he was not the only one to notice these anomalies. He recalled two other clerks who had begun to ask quiet questions about the pre-1913 books. Both had vanished from the department within a year without a word of explanation. A third colleague had managed to secure a transfer to a different agency and thereafter refused to even acknowledge Calloway's existence.
Calloway, being a man of cautious temperament and a father with a daughter to support, chose the path of silence. He kept his head down, performed his duties with robotic precision, and waited until he was on his deathbed to let the truth escape.
The financial system described in those old books was not centered on the issuance of debt or the manipulation of interest rates. It was built around a concept that Calloway called equity records. Oh, he clarified that this was not equity in the sense of stock ownership. These were records of perpetual claim, a form of title that did not depreciate over time, could not be taxed out of existence, and did not transfer through the standard legal mechanisms of sale or inheritance. It was a system of stewardship, where the owner was more accurately described as a custodian of a specific geographic or resource-based asset. In the context of the Tartarian civilization, this makes perfect sense. Researchers have found that the administrative remains of that culture point toward a governance model where land and resources were held in trust, governed by a layered hierarchy of custodians whose authority was rooted in the preservation of the system's integrity rather than personal enrichment. This brings us to the concept of the Great Erasure. This term has been adopted by a diverse group of independent scholars who have arrived at the same conclusion from different starting points. Some reached it through the study of star forts and the inexplicable architectural similarities found in cities as far apart as Omaha, St. Petersburg, and Manila. Others reached it through the analysis of census data and the strange orphan trains of the 19th century, which suggested a massive, unacknowledged demographic shift. Still others, like the pseudonymous academic who analyzed archival discontinuities, reached it through the study of the very ledgers Calloway handled. All signs point to a coordinated, global effort in the mid to late 19th century to systematically dismantle the physical and administrative infrastructure of the Tartarian civilization following a period of catastrophic disruption. Whether this disruption was natural, technological, or a combination of both remains a subject of intense debate, but the result was clear. A global power vacuum that was filled by the predecessors of our current institutional order. The 1913 transition was not the beginning of this erasure, but rather its final consolidating phase. By the time the Federal Reserve was established, the maps had already been redrawn, the history books had been rewritten, and the surviving administrative documents had been moved into secure custody. However, the one thing the new powers could not do was simply burn the old ledgers. In a complex society, you cannot stop an accounting system in mid-motion without triggering a collapse of the entire downstream record. The pre-1913 books had to be maintained as a bridge until the new debt-based system was robust enough to function independently. Calloway's job was to manage that bridge, to ensure that the unresolved claims from the old world did not interfere with the smooth operation of the new one. He told Margaret that the books contained hundreds of these unresolved stewardship claims. These were entries for territories that were officially part of the United States or other modern nations, yet the books still listed them as being held under the authority of Tartarian administrative units. When Margaret asked what this meant in practical terms, Calloway's response was chilling.
He said it meant that, from a strictly legal and accounting standpoint, the land had never changed hands. The current governments and private owners were, in effect, squatters on an estate whose original titles had never been extinguished. The transfer of power had happened through force and the rewriting of history, but it had never been ratified in the ultimate record of truth, the ledger. Callaway believed that the architects of the Federal Reserve were acutely aware of these unresolved claims. In fact, he argued that the very structure of the central banking system, its insulation from public oversight, its complex layers of secrecy, and its control over the narrative of value was designed specifically to bury these claims forever. They weren't trying to resolve the debt. They were trying to outlive the memory of the creditor. Callaway was one of the last people who possessed the specialized knowledge required to interpret the old notation system, and he knew that once his generation was gone, the books would become indecipherable to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking for. After the funeral, Margaret discovered the map her father had left for her. It wasn't a physical map, but a set of descriptive notes hidden in a safe deposit box in a city her father had never mentioned visiting. The notes were written in a personal shorthand, a code that took her months of painstaking effort to break. What she found was a list of 47 specific entries from the pre-1913 books. Callaway had provided enough detail for a researcher with the proper access to locate them, along with his own assessment of their significance. He noted that 31 of these entries had likely been removed from the archives entirely since he last saw them. 9 had been intentionally misfiled in obscure categories to ensure they would never be found by a standard search. But 6 of them, he believed, remained in their original locations, protected only by the sheer volume of the surrounding paperwork and the general lack of interest from the modern, digital-focused generation of archivists. The most mysterious part of the notes was an entry marked with a symbol Margaret didn't recognize. On his last night, Callaway had explained that this was not a record of a transfer or a claim, but a promissory notation. It was a form of institutional guarantee built into the Tartarian system, designed to act as a self-correcting mechanism in the event of a catastrophic discontinuity. It wasn't a promise of money, it was a promise of temporal persistence. It was a safeguard intended to ensure that the true record of the civilization would survive, regardless of what erasures were attempted by its successors. He believed that this record was still recoverable, and that the modern financial system was, at its core, a defensive perimeter designed to keep people away from that recovery. Margaret spent her remaining years contemplating the implications of this. She thought about the land, the vast stretches of territory that were supposedly owned, but were actually held under an open, unresolved account. She thought about the self-correcting mechanism, and whether it was something physical, something encoded into the very fabric of the world. Her father had mentioned the buildings toward the end of his life. He had noted that many of the geographic descriptors in the old books corresponded to specific, grand structures he had visited. He claimed that these buildings were not merely aesthetic achievements, they were functional components of the administrative system. Their proportions, their materials, and their placement were a form of stone accounting, a permanent physical record that could not be redacted by an ink pen or a fire. This perspective aligns perfectly with the observations of modern researchers who look at the old world architecture found in almost every major city on Earth. These buildings, with their massive domes, intricate friezes, and sophisticated energy management features, often predate the official settlement of the areas where they stand. They are frequently attributed to architects who had no formal training and were built using technologies that were supposedly unavailable at the time. Callaway's insight was that these buildings are actually ledger entries in stone. They are the physical manifestation of the stewardship claims he saw in the books. They are the temporal guarantee that the old system would remain visible, even if it was no longer understood. The legacy passed from Edmund to Margaret, and finally to her son. The son, who remains a private figure, has spent years quietly documenting these architectural anomalies. He doesn't look at a cathedral or a post office as a piece of art. He looks at it as a data point in a global accounting system that is still, technically, open. He has noticed that the proportions of these buildings often match the numerical ratios his grandfather described in the pre-1913 books. He has found that the pipe systems and foundations of these structures often serve no logical purpose within modern engineering, but make perfect sense if viewed as part of a different technological paradigm.
Edmund Callaway was not a man of theories. He was a clerk. He understood that a ledger does not care about your beliefs, your politics, or your version of history. A ledger only cares about the balance. And the balance of the world, as recorded in the pre-1913 books, has never been settled. The transition to the modern world was not a clean break. It was a messy, incomplete overlay. The old system, the Tartarian system of stewardship and continuity, was never formally closed. It was simply ignored, buried, and redacted. But as any accountant will tell you, an open entry remains open until it is reconciled. The weight of that continuity is what Callaway felt in those windowless rooms. It is the sense that the past is not dead, but merely waiting for someone with the eyes to read the record.
The books are still there, somewhere in the dark corners of the archives. The buildings are still there, standing in plain sight in our city centers. The maps are still there, tucked away in the special collections of libraries. And the promissory notation, the self-correcting mechanism, is still active, working through the slow, inevitable process of historical recovery. Callaway's final message to his daughter was one of quiet, persistent hope. He believed that the truth could not be permanently suppressed because it was built into the very foundation of the world. He didn't want a revolution. He wanted a reconciliation. He wanted the books to be closed properly, with honor and according to the rules of the old stewardship. Until that happens, we are living in the shadow of an unresolved account, walking through cities that are actually archives, and participating in a financial system that is fundamentally a fiction designed to hide a much older, much deeper reality.
The ledgers are waiting. The balance is pending. And the story of what happened before 1913 is the key to understanding everything that has happened since. This narrative serves as a testament to the power of the record and the resilience of the truth. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of stories we tell ourselves, but a set of accounts that must eventually be settled. Edmund Callaway did his part by speaking. Margaret did her part by writing. Now, the task falls to those who are willing to look at the world with the same precision and courage that a lone clerk once exercised in the silent basements of Washington. The books are still open. The evidence is all around us. The only question is whether we are ready to read what is written in the stone and the ink of a world we were never supposed to remember.
As we move further into the 21st century, the cracks in the post-1913 facade are becoming increasingly difficult to patch. The digital age, for all its potential for surveillance and control, has also allowed for the rapid cross-referencing of information that was previously siloed in distant archives. Researchers across the globe are now connecting the dots that Margaret Callaway spent her life trying to find. They are identifying the Office of Continental Settlement in obscure maritime records. They are finding the Tartarian notation system in the architectural blueprints of temporary World's Fair structures that were supposedly built of plaster but possessed foundations of deep poured concrete and steel. The great erasure is being undone, one ledger entry at a time.
The son of Margaret continues his work, not out of a desire for fame, but out of a sense of inherited duty. He understands that he is a custodian of a secret that is not meant to remain a secret forever. Every photograph he takes of a star fort or a neoclassical Capitol building is an act of reclamation. He is looking for the temporal guarantee, the mechanism that will finally force the reconciliation of the accounts. He suspects it might not be a single document or a single discovery, but a critical mass of awareness, a point at which the weight of the evidence becomes so great that the official narrative simply collapses under its own lack of integrity.
In the final analysis, the story of Edmund Callaway is a story about the sanctity of the truth. It is a reminder that even in the most powerful institutions, there are individuals who prioritize the accuracy of the record over the convenience of the state. It is a call to look more closely at the world we inhabit, to question the timelines we are given, and to recognize that the systems governing our lives are often built on foundations of silence and redaction. The pre-1913 books are more than just old ledgers. They are the blueprint of a different way of being, a way of being that recognized our connection to the land and our responsibility to the future. They are the open accounts of a civilization that refused to be forgotten, and they are the promise that eventually the balance will be restored.
We must consider the philosophical implications of a system that values stewardship over ownership. In our modern era, everything is framed through the lens of acquisition and the accumulation of debt. We are taught that to own is to have power, but the Tartarian model suggests that true power lies in the ability to maintain the continuity of the whole. This shift in perspective is perhaps the most dangerous element of Calloway's discovery. If the land cannot be owned, then the entire basis of modern property law and the financial systems built upon it are called into question. This is why the erasure had to be so thorough. It wasn't just about hiding a lost empire. It was about suppressing a competing idea of what it means to live on this planet. As the sun rose on the morning after her father's death, Margaret Calloway sat at her kitchen table, the notes spread out before her like the pieces of a cosmic puzzle. She felt the weight of the task ahead, the sheer impossibility of what she was being asked to do. But she also felt a strange sense of clarity. She realized that her father hadn't just given her a secret, he had given her a purpose. He had passed on the stewardship of the truth, and she, in turn, passed it to her son. Now, that stewardship is being passed to anyone who hears this story. The books are still open. The entries are still there. The buildings are still speaking. The only thing left to do is to finish the work that Edmund Calloway started in those windowless rooms so many years ago. We are the ones who must close the ledger. We are the ones who must settle the account.
And in doing so, we might just rediscover a world that was hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to come home to the truth of our own history. The legacy of the pre-1913 world is not a ghost story. It is a living reality that continues to shape our physical environment and our economic possibilities. The Office of Continental Settlement may no longer exist in name, but the territories it administered are still here. The stewardship claims may be unresolved, but the land still bears the marks of its original custodians. As we peel back the layers of the Great Erasure, we find not a void, but a vibrant, sophisticated past that offers a different path for the future. Calloway's long silence was a form of protection, a way to ensure that the information survived until the time was right. That time is now. The silence has been broken, the notes have been decoded, and the ledger is ready for its final entry. Let us be the generation that has the courage to write it. Let us be the ones who finally reconcile the past with the present, and in doing so, unlock the potential of a future that is no longer built on the foundations of a lie. The books are open. The world is watching. The balance is ours to settle.